I have studied the collapse of civilizations long enough to recognize the moment when power moves. It never announces itself. It never arrives with fanfare. It simply shifts, quietly and permanently, while those who once commanded it continue speaking as if nothing has changed. What happened in February 2025 felt like a trade dispute. American officials treated it as political theater. The media covered it as diplomatic friction between neighbors. But historians will mark this as the moment when the longest undefended border in the world became the boundary between empire and its successor. For over a century, the relationship operated on mathematical certainty. Canada supplied resources. America provided markets. The equation was stable because geography made it inevitable. Canadian wheat, oil, minerals, and timber flowed south. American capital, technology, and finished goods flowed north. This was not partnership. This was extraction with polite language. The arrangement endured because Canada had nowhere else to go. The United States controlled access to global markets. American companies dominated international trade networks. American military power secured shipping lanes. Canadian prosperity depended on American permission, and everyone understood this dependency created permanent subordination. That mathematical certainty died when Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and energy in February 2025. Not because the tariffs were economically devastating, though they were, not because the policy was diplomatically destructive, though it was, but because it forced Canada to discover what empires throughout history have learned too late. Subordinates with alternatives become competitors. Subordinates without alternatives become enemies. The response revealed how completely American policymakers misunderstood the forces they had unleashed. They expected Canada to negotiate. They expected concessions on dairy markets and defense spending. They expected the familiar pattern of Canadian complaints followed by Canadian compliance. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. The Canadian public simply said no. This was not government policy. This was collective decision-making by millions of individuals who reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Canadian travel to the United States collapsed by 37% in March alone. Cross-border shopping, a tradition spanning generations, simply stopped. The Abacus polling firm found that 68% of Canadians planned to avoid American goods and services for at least 18 months. The economic impact reached $4.2 billion in lost revenue within 6 months. But the real damage was psychological. For the first time in modern history, Canada was treating the United States as optional. The mathematics of dependency had reversed, and American border communities discovered they needed Canadian customers more than Canadian customers needed American products. This is where history always turns. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of small decisions that compound into structural transformation. Rome fell not to barbarian invasion, but to the gradual realization that Roman citizenship no longer guaranteed prosperity. The British Empire dissolved not through revolutionary war, but through the patient construction of alternatives that made British approval irrelevant. Canada began constructing those alternatives with surgical precision. While American officials focused on immediate political gains, Canadian planners implemented the $1.2 trillion sovereignty investment program. This was not deficit spending for social programs. This was strategic capital expenditure designed to permanently restructure North American trade flows. $340 billion over 5 years went to east-west trade corridors that bypass American markets entirely. Another $280 billion targeted critical minerals processing, ensuring that Canada would capture value domestically rather than shipping raw materials south for American refinement. But the most audacious component was the $180 billion commitment to the Arctic Gateway Initiative, centered on the port of Churchill in Manitoba. For decades, Churchill existed as a northern curiosity, the polar bear capital of the world. But geography is mathematics, and the mathematics are unforgiving. Churchill is the only deepwater Arctic port in North America directly connected to the continental rail network. As climate change opens northern shipping routes, Churchill becomes the most strategically valuable port on the continent. A cargo ship traveling from Hamburg to Winnipeg saves 6,400 kilometers by using Churchill rather than traditional routes through the St. Lawrence or American ports. That represents 12 days of transit time and approximately $620,000 in fuel costs per voyage. In an industry where margins are measured in pennies per ton, this constitutes revolutionary competitive advantage. The Hudson Bay Railway, that single line of steel running nearly 1,000 kilometers from Winnipeg to the Arctic coast, was transformed from regional freight line to strategic national asset. The government fast-tracked $67 billion in upgrades, installing thermal siphons to protect permafrost, building automated switching systems, and constructing grain terminals capable of loading 100,000-ton vessels. By September 2025, the first post-Panamax container ship docked in Churchill, loaded with Canadian wheat destined for Germany. The symbolism was unmistakable. Canada was serving notice that North American trade no longer required American permission or American infrastructure. The market responded immediately. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as European buyers recognized they could source directly from Canada without American intermediaries. Potash prices, where Canada controls nearly half of global reserves, spiked 31% as fertilizer companies scrambled to secure supply agreements that bypassed American ports. But infrastructure alone does not create independence. True sovereignty requires diplomatic diversification. While Trump alienated traditional allies, Canada quietly built a coalition of alternatives. The signing of comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union integrated Canadian companies into European military supply chains worth $244 billion. This was not just commerce. This was insurance against American abandonment of NATO commitments. The Asia-Pacific strategy proved equally sophisticated. Canada signed bilateral trade deals with Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, targeting the 700 million person Asian market with combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion. The message was clear. Canadian resources could reach global markets without American approval. Even the relationship with China was recalibrated with surgical precision. In November 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney met with President Xi Jinping in what both leaders described as a strategic reset. Without endorsing Chinese political systems, Canada positioned itself as a pragmatic middle power, willing to trade with all sides while serving as proxy for none. This neutrality allowed Canadian companies to maintain access to both American and Chinese markets, while their American competitors faced binary choices. The results became visible immediately. By year-end, Canadian exports to the European Union increased 34%. Exports to Asia rose 28%. Meanwhile, American agricultural exports declined as international buyers found alternative suppliers, not subject to political uncertainty. Private capital flows told the same story. Foreign investment in Canadian logistics and infrastructure jumped 340% in the final quarter of 2025. Global capital was voting with money, betting that Canada, not the United States, represented stability and growth in North America. This pattern has appeared before in history. When Britain imposed the Stamp Act on American colonies, the initial response was economic boycott and alternative development. When Rome increased taxation on Germanic tribes, the reaction was confederation and trade network construction. The mechanism is always identical. Excessive pressure creates organizational alternatives that ultimately replace the original system. What makes the Canadian case unique is the sophistication of execution. This was not emotional nationalism or reactive policymaking. This was strategic patience applied with mathematical precision. Every infrastructure investment served multiple purposes. Every diplomatic relationship created redundant options. Every economic decision reduced dependency while increasing leverage. The timing coordinated around a single date. July 1st, 2026 marks the mandatory review of USMCA, where all three countries must decide whether to renew the agreement for another 16 years. Trump viewed this deadline as leverage, assuming 18 months of pressure would bring Canada and Mexico to negotiate from desperation. Instead, as the review approaches, panic is visible in Washington rather than Ottawa. The December 2025 U.S. Trade Representative hearings were supposed to demonstrate American strength. They revealed American dependency. Over 3 days, 147 American business leaders testified, begging the administration not to destroy trade relationships that American companies could not function without. The American Apple Association warned that losing Canadian market access would bankrupt thousands of farms. The Automotive Policy Council showed that single car parts crossed the border 7 times during production. Taxing each crossing at 25% would add $1,400 to American-made vehicles. Ford cited supply chain disruptions for $1.4 billion in losses. GM closed 2 Michigan plants due to expensive Canadian components. Trade economists began drawing historical parallels. Lawrence Summers noted the situation resembled the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act of 1930, which triggered global trade war and deepened the Great Depression. But the comparison understated the current danger. The 1930s tariffs damaged existing relationships. The 2025 tariffs created permanent alternatives. This brings us to the core insight that explains why Trump's strategy backfired so completely. Leverage in international relations is not determined by economic size. It is determined by alternatives. For 80 years, the United States maintained dominance over Canada by ensuring Canada had no choice but to sell to American markets and buy American goods. That monopoly has been systematically, permanently broken. Canada enters the USMCA review with signed trade deals, completed infrastructure, and unified domestic support. Mark Carney can sit across from American negotiators and say, "We want partnership, but we do not require subordination. If you prefer economic war, we have built the systems to survive it." Can you say the same? The United States faces a $1.6 trillion hole in its economy if USMCA collapses. Half of that trade involves intermediate goods that fuel American manufacturing. Unlike Canada, the United States spent the last 18 months alienating existing partners rather than building alternative relationships. Mexico coordinated closely with Canada throughout this period, recognizing that their strength lies in unity. Both countries aligned their negotiating positions and shared intelligence about American vulnerabilities. They understand that if they stand together, the United States cannot afford to lose both simultaneously. The mathematics are brutal for American negotiators. The United States imports $429 billion worth of goods from Canada and Mexico annually. American manufacturers design production systems around North American supply chains. Replacing those relationships would require years and cost hundreds of billions. Canada, by contrast, has already begun that replacement process. The infrastructure is operational, the trade relationships are signed, the diplomatic alternatives are established. When USMCA review begins, Canada will negotiate from strength, not need. What we are witnessing is not just policy adjustment. This is historical correction that has been decades in development. For too long, Canada accepted the role of resource colony, shipping raw materials south and buying back finished goods at premium prices. The pandemic exposed the vulnerability of that model. Trump's tariffs provided political justification to abandon it permanently. The infrastructure being built today is irreversible. The trade relationships being forged are sticky. Even if future American administrations offer to return to previous arrangements, the diversification will not simply reverse itself. The Canadian executive who spent 2 years developing markets in Vietnam will not abandon them for American convenience. More importantly, trust has been broken. In international relations, trust is the most valuable currency. When you treat partners like enemies, when you weaponize economic relationships for political theater, you do not get to reset when convenient. This is the birth of a different kind of superpower. Not a superpower of aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons, but a superpower of geography, resources, and strategic positioning. Canada controls the world's longest coastline, 20% of global freshwater, and increasingly, the keys to Arctic passages that will define 21st century trade routes. The warming Arctic has transformed Canada's northern territories from frozen barrier into highway. The Northwest Passage, blocked by ice for most of human history, now offers shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia. Unlike the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, which can be controlled by hostile powers, the Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territorial waters. Every ship that uses Churchill, every ton of wheat loaded in Hudson Bay, strengthens Canadian legal claims to Arctic sovereignty. It transforms theoretical map lines into physical reality backed by commercial precedent. The United States finds itself in an unprecedented position, economically dependent on a country it chose to treat as adversary. American refineries need Canadian oil. American manufacturers need Canadian aluminum. American agriculture needs Canadian fertilizer. This dependency was manageable when Canada had no alternatives. It becomes strategic vulnerability when Canada can sell to highest bidders in global markets. The irony is profound. In attempting to make America great again by reducing foreign dependence, Trump actually increased American vulnerability by creating a more independent Canada. The quiet neighbor to the north, which had been content to remain in America's economic orbit, was pushed into building its own gravitational field. Other middle powers are studying the Canadian model with intense interest. Australia, Brazil, South Africa, all resource-rich nations that have chafed under great power dominance, are analyzing Canadian strategy. The lesson is clear. In a multipolar world, exclusive alignment with any single power, even a friendly one, represents vulnerability. True sovereignty requires alternatives. Canada spent 18 months building those alternatives, while the United States spent that time destroying relationships. The world discovered that the junior partner in North America had become peer competitor. This is not the end of U.S.-Canada relations. Geography, culture, and economic integration ensure continued connection. But it is the end of the assumption that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. The new reality involves mutual dependence between equals rather than colonial extraction model. Canada proved that middle powers armed with smart strategy and patient execution can reshape continental balance. The question now is whether America can adapt to having true partner rather than subordinate. The answer will determine not just North American trade, but broader patterns of great power interaction in multipolar world. History does not punish intentions. It only records outcomes. The outcome of this sequence is structurally determined. What remains is political recognition of what has already occurred. That recognition has not yet arrived. When it does, nothing will have changed except perception. By the time this transformation becomes obvious to mainstream analysis, it will no longer matter whether anyone approves. The frameworks will be established. The alternatives will exist. The dependencies will be reversed. And Canada will operate as resource power with options, rather than subordinate with obligations. This is what irreversible looks like before people recognize it as irreversible. Power moved quietly while attention focused elsewhere. Recognition is simply delayed. When it arrives, it will feel sudden despite being entirely predictable to anyone watching foundations rather than headlines.